Okay, let's dive in. Think about this. Over 75% of Kenya's population is under 35. That's just huge. Today, we're really going deep into Kenya in 2025, looking specifically at this massive youth group and what it means for politics right now.
Yeah, that statistic alone, it tells you so much, doesn't it? The hopes, the frustrations, the dreams of young Kenyans, they're absolutely central if you want to understand where the country is heading. Their engagement, or well, their lack of engagement, it holds enormous power.
Exactly. And to, really get our heads around it, we've been digging into this fictional podcast source. It's called Kenya 2025, Youth, Politics, and the Future. Think of it as our main focus for today. It gives us a kind of snapshot of the key political stuff and how young people are engaging or not engaging this year. It features a host, Alex, and this youth policy analyst, Tasha.
Right. And by using this specific scenario, it lets us move past just general ideas and really get into the nitty-gritty discussions happening, on the ground about youth and politics in Kenya, specifically in 2025.
So our mission today is pretty clear. Let's unpack the political climate in Kenya right now and really analyze how it's hitting young Kenyans directly. We want to pull out the most important insights from this source, give you a clear, sort of concise picture of what's a really dynamic situation. So where should we start? Maybe the broader political landscape in 2025.
Good place to start. Okay, so President Ruto is about halfway through his term now, and a huge part of his campaign, you'll remember, was the bottom-up economic transformation agenda. We really need to look at how that's playing out, especially for younger people. This whole bottom-up idea, fundamentally, it was meant to empower people at the base of the economic pyramid, financial inclusion, supporting small businesses, that kind of thing.
Right. And our source, the podcast, it does point to some things being reported as successes, stuff like the Hustler Fund that was meant for accessible capital, right?
Yeah.
And growth in digital jobs, some infrastructure projects. Those get highlighted as, positive steps.
Yeah, but the source also really emphasizes the major economic problems lots of Kenyans are facing, particularly young people. The cost of living is just sky high. That's a huge point of concern. And it's made worse by things like VAT increases and these, what the source calls controversial finance bills.
Controversial how? Like, what's the impact?
Well, measures in those bills. Things like potential tax hikes on everyday items or services.
Yeah.
They can hit younger people really hard. People often on lower, less stable incomes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds like these economic pressures are, maybe unsurprisingly, fueling a big jump in activism, both social and political. The podcast mentions more protests happening, a lot more young people using social media, TikTok, Twitter, X, to complain, to challenge the government, and also the rise of these issue-based movements.
Exactly. Groups forming around specific problems, unemployment, education access, things like that, rather than just sticking to the old party lines. And this increased activism, it's a really strong signal. It shows the level of engagement, maybe, but also probably the level of frustration among young Kenyans. The digital world has become, a really powerful space for them to organize, get the word out, share their views in ways that maybe bypass the older, more traditional political channels.
Okay, but here's something fascinating in the source highlights. There's a bit of a tension, isn't there? On one hand, you see this definite increase in engagement. In governance discussions, TikTok activism, Twitter debates, youth-led petitions, it really seems like young people are more aware, more vocal than maybe ever before.
That's definitely one side of it. A generation that's super connected online, active in these digital civic spaces.
But then you look at the 2022 elections, and the source points to really low youth voter turnout. How do those two things fit together? It seems kind of contradictory.
It does, and that apparent contradiction is really revealing. The source suggests there's this widespread feeling of disillusionment among young people, since, casting a vote doesn't actually lead to real change in their lives.
Like their vote doesn't count.
Kind of, yeah. Or that it doesn't translate into practical improvements. Plus, there's the issue of the established political families, these so-called political dynasties, where power seems to stick within the same families generation after generation. That can make young people feel like the whole system isn't really open to them, not responsive to new voices or ideas. You actually see similar things in other places with big youth populations, this link between feeling politically ineffective and lower turnout.
It really makes you wonder. The podcast stresses how dominant youth are in other areas like culture, digital stuff, innovation, starting businesses. What could actually happen if all that energy, that dynamism, was somehow intentionally focused on politics? It feels like this huge untapped potential.
Exactly right. If that creativity, that drive, could be properly channeled into political participation, well, it could be completely transformative. The big challenge, though, is bridging that gap, the gap between their cultural influence and their actual power in formal politics.
Okay, let's maybe zero in on some specific policies. The ones our source says are really hitting Kenyan youth hard in 2025.
Unemployment. That's a massive one. The statistic cited is pretty brutal. Roughly 4 out of every 10 young Kenyans are jobless.
4 in 10. Wow.
Yeah. And that's not just an economic problem, is it? It's a potential source of social instability, too.
And education, what about that?
Well, the podcast mentions ongoing reforms in technical and vocational education and training, TVET. The goal is to give young people practical skills for the job market. But a key problem mentioned is funding. There just isn't enough money being put into these programs to really make a massive difference, apparently.
Okay, what else? The digital economy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Huge potential there for jobs, for innovation, especially for young people.
Yeah.
But the source points out challenges, too. Like, the sector is evolving so fast, it's kind of underregulated. And then there are these tricky issues around taxation for young creators. Sometimes they're getting taxed before they even make a decent income.
That sounds complicated.
It is. Like, no clear rules on taxing digital content creation. That can really stifle things, discourage people from even trying.
And then there's the housing levy, right, and other new taxes.
Yes, the podcast really highlights the frustration around these. A lack of clarity, people wondering how these deductions will actually benefit them, especially young people already struggling to afford things.
And all this ties into well-being, too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The source draws a pretty worrying line between all this economic strain, the lack of opportunities, and rising feelings of hopelessness, mental health challenges among young people. It's quite sobering thinking about the psychological toll of these economic realities on such a huge part of the population.
Which brings up a really crucial question. How responsive is the government in 2025 to what young people actually need and are concerned about?
The podcast suggests it's complicated, nuanced. There's a sense that the government does react when there's enough public pressure, enough noise, as the source puts it. But it seems more reactive than proactive. Like responding to outcry rather than consistently proactively engaging with the underlying needs and, the aspirations of young Kenyans.
Okay, putting out fires rather than building foundations.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit, because the source does also talk about some more hopeful signs, like the emergence of young leaders and more power at the grassroots level.
Yes, and this is where you see some really concrete signs of change happening. The podcast notes this trend. It might be slow, but it's happening of more young people actually putting themselves forward, running for political office, even at the local level, like, youth representatives, members of county assemblies, MCAs.
And they're campaigning differently too, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's moving way beyond just the old posters and rallies.
Yeah.
The source talks about really innovative stuff, using podcasts, creating memes that go viral, using street art, doing live streams, basically connecting directly with people online and offline, putting pressure on in new ways.
That makes sense. Using the tools they know best.
Exactly. It shows how digitally savvy this generation is and how they can build connections outside of the traditional media and political machines.
And the podcast really bangs the drum about grassroots movements, local organizing. They even use Sakaja in Nairobi as an example. He started as a youth rep, right? To show the kind of impact you can have. The message seems to be, you've got to be active, get involved locally. Like the source says, you have to show up.
Yeah, and that local involvement, that's the bedrock of real political participation, isn't it? It's at that level, county assemblies, local committees, that young people can directly influence the decisions that affect their everyday lives, and from there, build a path to wider influence.
So thinking ahead, the 2027 elections, the podcast really emphasizes the potential power there, the youth vote.
Oh, absolutely. Just look at the numbers again. Young voters could potentially be the ones who decide the outcome, but the source stresses it's crucial how they organize. The idea is they need to unite around shared values, a common vision for the country.
Rather than just tribal lines or getting small handouts.
Yeah. Precisely. Rather than being swayed by what the source calls tribes or tokens, ethnic loyalties or short-term cash incentives, that shift could be transformative for the whole nation.
So what needs to happen now to make that potential real?
Well, the podcast really hammers home the need for political education now.
Yeah.
And active civic engagement. And it's not just about the presidential election every 5 years. It's about understanding how local government works, knowing who your MCA is, figuring out how specific policies actually hit your wallet, your rent, your phone bill.
Right, connecting the dots between big politics and daily life.
Exactly, broadening the whole idea of what politics even means. It's not some abstract thing happening far away. It's about the roads you use, the job opportunities available, the price of food, your freedom online. All of that is politics.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into Kenya in 2025, focusing on the youth experience, the podcast leaves us with a really powerful final thought, doesn't it?
It really does. It sort of reframes the whole timeline. Young Kenyans in 2025, they aren't just the leaders of tomorrow waiting in the wings. They're right here, right now, on the battleground today, as the source puts it. The idea is that real systemic change isn't something to wait for. It demands their involvement right now.
Yeah.
Sustained engagement.
And the call to action that comes out of the source material is so direct, it's empowering. It basically tells listeners, and by extension young Kenyans, look, you need to organize. Learn about the issues, speak out, use your vote, put pressure on leaders, create solutions. That's how you build a better Kenya.
Yeah. Ultimately, this whole discussion, it just highlights the incredible influence young people have, not just because there are so many of them, but because they have the energy, the ideas, the capacity to really drive change. It's a powerful reminder that their voices matter immensely. Their active participation is essential for shaping the country's future.
Absolutely. So for you listening right now, take that message on board. Your voice, your actions, they really do have weight. Let's keep this conversation going, share these insights, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.